Good day, everyone. In our previous video, we talked about entity relationship model. But today, we are going to look at entity relationship diagram. Our topic for today is entity relationship diagram. Now let us look at the objectives of this lesson. What are the objectives of this lesson? As the lesson progresses, students should state additional features of entity relationship model. Describe each additional features of entity relationship model. Define entity relationship diagram. List symbol used for the various ER components. State classification of attributes in the ER model. Number 6. Describe each classification of attributes in the ER model. What are the additional features of ER model? Additional features of ER model are 1. Primary key, weak entity sets, strong entity sets. Now we are going to look at them one after the other. What do you understand by primary key? This is an attribute that can uniquely define an entity set. What do you understand by weak entity set? They are entity sets that do not have enough attributes to establish primary key. What do you understand by strong entity set? They are entity sets that have enough attributes to establish primary key. So when you look at the two, you will notice that one do not have enough attributes to establish primary key, while the other one have enough attributes to establish primary key. Now, we are going to look at the two tables. This table represents strong entity sets. Why? Because this table have enough attributes to establish primary key, and the primary key on this table is the ID column is the primary key. Now let us look at the second table. The second table is weak entity set. Why? Because this table does not have enough attributes to establish primary key. There is no primary key on this table, so this table represents weak entity set. Now, let us look at entity relationship diagram. What do you understand by entity relationship diagram? The entity relationship diagram is a graphical representation of the ER model. Now we are going to look at the symbols one by one, as the definition says that graphical representation of the ER model. So we have symbols that we use to represent each of the components of the ER model. Like entity, we have a symbol that we use to represent entity. We have a symbol that represents relationship, and so on. Now, entity, we use rectangle to represent entity. An example is students. And then the second one, which is the weak entity, we use double rectangle to represent weak entity. An example is assignment. Now let's look at the one we use to represent attributes. We use ellipse to represent attributes. An example is roll number. So we use rhombus to represent relationship. An example is saves in. And then let us look at the last one, key attributes. We use ellipse to represent key attributes. The ellipse, the attributes will be underlined. And example is roll number. So these are the symbols that we use to represent each of the components of the ER model. Now let's look at the classification of attributes in the ER model, the way we classify our attributes. classification of attributes in the AR model are multi-valued attributes. 2. Composite attributes. 3. Derived attributes. Now let us look at this classification of attributes in the AR model one after the other. What do you understand by multi-valued attributes? Multi-value attribute. This is illustrated with a double line ellipse. As you can see the symbol below, it is illustrated with a double line ellipse which has more than one value for at least one instance of its entity. For example, the telephone attributes of an individual may have one or more values. That is, an individual can have one or more telephone numbers. Yes, you can have more than one telephone number, and this is an example of multi-valued attributes. You can see the symbol there, attributes with double ellipse. We use double ellipse to represent multi-value attribute. What do you understand by composite attribute? This may itself contains two or more attributes which represent more basic attributes with independent meaning of their own. For example, the address attribute is usually a composite attribute composed of attributes such as streets, areas, and so on. The symbol below represents composite attributes. So when you look at this symbol, you look at the symbol, then you look at the second symbol, which serves as the example. And then when you look at address, you will notice that address contains additional two attributes, which is street and area. So street, area serve as the components of what? Of the address. Address consists of the street and area. So this means that address here is a composite attribute because it consists of another attribute, street and area. What do you understand by derived attributes? These are attributes whose value is entirely dependent on another attribute and are indicated by dashes ellipses. For example, the age attribute of a person is the best example of derived attribute. The age of a person can be determined from the current date and the person's birth date. Yes, this means that when you have someone's date of birth, you'll be able to determine the age of that person. Now, let us look at the symbol and example of derived attributes. You can see the image. You can see the image dashed ellipse is an example. Is a symbol used to represent derived attributes. And the example is age, as we explained earlier, that when you have someone's date of birth, you'll be able to determine the age. So age is an example, or let me say date of birth is a good example of derived attributes. Thank you. That is the end of the lesson. In our next video, we'll look at the way we can construct entity relationship model with all these symbols. Thank you. God bless you.